Without further ado, let me briefly introduce our presenters in the order that they'll be speaking. They represent 4 different kinds of fellows among the 50 or so scholars who have been with us all year. Amanda Joyce Hall, an external faculty fellow, is an assistant professor, and I should mention in each case, she's an external faculty fellow, one of 8, is an assistant professor of history at University of California, Santa Barbara. Amanda, I learned just yesterday, was a classics major as an undergraduate and obtained a master's degree at Fordham with which she taught middle school in the South Bronx, and another MA in history from Columbia and the London School of Economics, and finally a PhD in history at Yale. She is a scholar of global anti-apartheid and in the context of Black internationalism and 20th century Black social movements, Black world social movements. Jesuseyi Osundeko is a dissertation prize fellow, one of 9 fellows at that stage, 5 in her category and 4 more who are what we call next generation scholars. She is, as they all are in that category, a PhD candidate at Stanford, in her case in English. She has a bachelor's degree in English from University of Pennsylvania, and her project investigates women's practices of self-mourning through African and Black diasporic literature. Mudit Trivedi, an internal faculty fellow, one of 8, is an archaeologist with interest in recovering the traces of religious subjectivity in material culture. His research is heavily involved with a particular archaeological project that he's been overseeing for a number of years in North India, and in which the objective is conversion to Islam, traces of conversion to Islam. He is associate professor of anthropology at Stanford. And finally, did I get it wrong? Did I promote you? I inadvertently promoted him. Okay, sorry about that. Finally, Timothy Pantoja is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow, one of 11 who are with us this year. In his case, he's in the Department of African and African American Studies. Tim is a scholar of literature whose research is involved in exploring the ways that Black artists in the 20th century represent their own thought in terms of, let me see if I can describe this to him. I know it's really hard. He describes it much better than I can. In terms of how Black artists in the 20th century represent their thought in terms of cognition and feeling, rather than as the isolated reflections of discrete individuals. And what he's really after is the beginnings of the makings of community through the way that we talk about our thinking. At the center of his project is a recasting of empathy, not as an abstraction, but as a kind of experience that is at once bodily and self-aware. Tim has a master's in divinity from Harvard and a PhD in English from New York University. And so with that, let's start off with Amanda.
I want to begin by expressing my appreciation to my fellow fellows for the conversations that we've had over the last few months about crisis. My reflections were very much forged in relation to, in affirmation of, and in contradistinction to our fellowshipping over the year. So today I want to consider the theme of the intellectual's role in times of crises by reversing the question. What does the intellectual call a crisis, and what does that labeling conceal? What is the crisis? I come from an intellectual tradition of naming, where naming the thing is important. So here's my accounting based on the conversations this year. Is the crisis the fascistic and white supremacist policies of the Trump administration? Is it the abandonment of diversity, equity, and inclusion by liberal and juridical institutions? Is it the banning of Black, queer, and ethnic studies, or the shuttering and consolidation of their hard-fought and hard-won departments and programs? Is it capitalism's corruption of democracy? It's gilding the pathway to authoritarianism in gold and computer chips made of minerals extracted from the Congo? Is it the near complete gutting of the 1965 Voting Rights Act and the forms of political abandonment that have followed? Is it the terrorization and detention of hundreds of thousands of people by ICE and the fatal shootings of people who dare to stand witness to state violence? Is it the unhinged and unvarnished face of US imperialism seen in abduction, assassination, warmongering, economic blockade, and siege upon other nations? Is it the mass sexual violence inflicted on thousands of Sudanese women? Is it the tens of thousands of slain, maimed, starved, and orphaned Palestinian children funded by our tax dollars? Is it the now exposed sexual exploitation of young girls at the hands of moneyed elites documented in the Epstein files? Is it the warming planet, the corporate bought press, the collapse of literacy, the relentless expansion of the carceral state, the outsourcing of thought to AI and sociality to screens, the exploitation and disposability of Amazon workers and contingent faculty alike, the mass shootings at schools, grocery stores, and places of worship? Is it gas prices, wage stagnation, inflation, skyrocketing health insurance premiums, companies profiting off of sickness rather than wellness? Is the crisis that is too expensive to simply stay alive? Crises abound. Political crises notwithstanding, the experience of being on a college campus can be a dissociating one. Some administrators abdicate responsibility for social concerns. Some professors avoid discussing present issues and use their research as escape. Meanwhile, students seeking to break the veneer of the apolitical, idyllic campus and draw attention to the crises are arrested, prosecuted, and swiftly disciplined. Business as usual reigns at the college or university that has been remade in the image of the market. It was in the 1960s and 70s that many intellectuals from civil rights, Black power, New Left, and Third Worldist traditions came to understand education as a terrain of struggle, where one of the central things at stake was the intellectual and institutional integrity. Their movements advocating for free speech, anti-war, Black and ethnic studies, and anti-apartheid drew attention to how racist, capitalist, and imperialist social and political norms produced structures of alienation on campus and in the larger world. They transformed their research and lived experiences into analyses of world systems, institutional structures, and ideological formations, building fields and departments that understood crisis-informed intellectual work as social responsibility. Their historical task was clear: to transform universities from sites of learning into ones of consciousness. For much of modern history, universities trained students in habits of class reproduction. Learning meant mastering lessons, acquiring credentials, and securing white-collar employment. This model of education dislocated students from the collective consciousness of the masses, who bore disproportionately the brunt of society's crises. In a speech at the University of Georgia in 1979, civil rights and Black power activist Kwame Ture declared, quote, "The job of the university here is to put you to sleep," end quote. The metaphor of sleep suggests that the university engages in a form of political defanging or neutralization that keeps students from living in awareness. Likewise, education writer and theorist Tony K. Bambara noted the presence of sleepwalkers on campuses, students who cope with the inadequacy and irrelevance of their educations by living in dislocated, bifurcated worlds. Instead, Bambara dreamed of a university that was attentive to political and social realities, one that collapsed, quote, "the terrifying gap between academia and the real world," end quote. To be awake was to assist one's people, one's community. It was to deploy one's knowledge in service of the people. To wake, be awake, or woke originally referred to one's consciousness and ability to identify, appraise, and mobilize around an analysis of race, class, gender, and imperialism. Awakenedness was a quest to enrich education and fortify civil society. Its opponents have intentionally distorted and denigrated this method and decried wokeism and DEI hegemony as the root of our crises. They weaken institutional and intellectual integrity with their demands for an uncritical glorification of Western civilization, one that is abstracted from histories of dispossession, slavery, and expropriation. Nostalgic for the days when the university served a homogenous elite few, they seek to relegate many of us to realms of dislocation. However, dislocation can be mobilized. Historically, the most effective critiques of power and inequality have come from the edge, from the colonies, from the ghettos, from the periphery. A critical position of dislocation without despair or despondence can fuel institutional critique and redistributive transformation. So can intellectuals and their institutions afford to turn away from crisis now at this historical conjuncture? In times when all choices, even the seemingly apolitical ones, only work to facilitate our own immiseration, student movements in history have led the way time and time again as they fought for universities that were not complicit in war, authoritarianism, apartheid, prisons, fossil fuels, and genocide. It was at these inflection points that students and professors together carved out spaces of analysis capable of responding to the crises of their times, and they compelled their universities to support them. Today, it is those intellectuals and their fields, the ones most prepared to diagnose crisis, marry clarity of analysis to conscience, and generate solutions that are under attack. In 1990, the poet and writer June Jordan penned an article in The Progressive titled "Diversity or Death," in which she described the centrality of diversity to US politics as a struggle to, quote, redistribute power so that people of whatever color or culture or sexual persuasion shall possess equality before the law and due representation in government and due representation in the academic curricula and on the faculties and in the student bodies of our democracy, end quote. For Jordan, diversity was not an issue of liberal inclusion or shallow representation, nor should it have become a watered down tool of professionalism. It was a demand for the redistribution of power and an analysis rooted in uncomfortable truths about our collective past. The backlash it has provoked reveals how threatening and how powerful that demand has been. We would be remiss to abandon it now and abdicate our larger intellectual responsibility, which begins with telling the truth plainly and fearlessly about the crises of our times. So crises abound, yes, and struggle persists. Jordan reminds us that the future is not foreclosed. It is contested, contingent, and ours to fashion. But we are fortunate, she wrote. Not all of the currently powerful are blind. Not all of the currently privileged despise the clear commandments of a democratic state. And not all the rest of us have died. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jesuseyi, and I would also like to begin by thanking the Humanities Center, my fellow fellows, and for a really incredible year of scholarship and community in the midst of several crises. I also want to thank my co-panelists. I'm really honored to present next to you all. I wanted to begin with an experience that I had several years ago at the Black Archives in East Amsterdam. Among the collections were declassified FBI documents, 25-cent Black Panther periodicals, and ink-stained flyers for a debate between Marcus Garvey and Otto S. Wood. While wading through these documents, books, and artwork in English and Dutch, I came across a tall, semi-transparent screen surrounded by a wooden frame. In bold letters it could barely contain, it asked, "What would you have done had race not compelled you to fight?" For me, this was a question that prompted deep reflection as well as deep grief. While there are multiple ways to interpret this question, for me, The archive was asking how I would have lived had I not been shaped by birth by the very systems of exploitation and violence that had brought me to the archive and to my career in the first place. But why would an archive dedicated to engaging the past through preserving its record ask me and others in the center to reflect on a past that never happened? That particular question and that particular grief has shaped my research and my understanding of this question of our work in the time of crisis. As Roland mentioned, I research practices of self-mourning. And self-mourning is exactly what it sounds like, but grieving the self. Previously, the term described individuals anticipating their own death or reflecting on their own mortality. So it was often used concerning patients that were terminally ill. But I've tried to expand the term to include intangible losses of self, a loss of futurity, a loss of potential, a loss of self-determination. In other words, rather than grieving the fact that one must die, self-mourning can mean grieving how one must live. And to return to the Black Archives question, to grieve not only who we are, but who we could have been and who we should have been. My work revolves around African and Black diasporic literature, where self-mourning is gendered, layered, and generational. There, the question of who might we have been, what should we have done, and what would this place look like if, both haunts and drives these literatures. From a utilitarian standpoint, dwelling on the non-real, abiding in regret and grief don't seem to add anything to the world. We're meant only to think of what is tangible, what is concrete, and what is applicable. But not everything we have lost is tangible, and that demands another kind of grieving. Intellectuals in a time of crisis need not reinvent the wheel. The time of crisis has always found the intellectual, the artist, the craftsperson at work. We live through the way that we think, and we live through the way that we feel. And so the job of the intellectual is to expand our thoughts and our emotions as a way to expand our engagement with life itself. My work as an intellectual has been to expand our understanding of and practice of mourning. My job has been to give others the permission to sit with deep and perpetual grief. How do we allow ourselves to work with grief instead of through it? How do we accept our own grief instead of treating it like a problem to be solved or a disease to be cured? I regard self-mourning as a practice with generative potential, as it mobilizes our imagination toward realities that we haven't seen yet, but that we must aspire toward. The practice of imagining myself outside of race is not only a practice of remembering that race in and of itself is a construction that I did not have to experience, but also a practice of thinking through the distance between my reality and the one that I should have experienced. My determination to create a more just world is not only for the people that are coming after me and for the people around me, but for the version of myself and the version of them that they can't yet inhabit. How can we traverse that distance? I believe that one of the bridges between who we are and who we want to be is not just hope, but also grief. So in times of crisis, we fight and we grieve for what we have lost, for what we deserve, and what we can only imagine. Thank you.
I want to start with an acknowledgement of saying you've had 10 minutes of a sample of how good my year has been. I really mean this. This center, this room has been a scene, a shelter from all the crises we are here to talk about, but an inspiration for all trials present and those that are to come. Folks, what I want to talk about today is that crisis just isn't what it used to be. Much has changed, and fast, about the intelligibility crisis once afforded. A relationship had existed, it had held since the Enlightenment, between critique and crisis, between society and the state, between injustice and the intellectual's role of making the world critically, newly intelligible. Crisis used to authorize and justify our work of critique. But today, crisis authorizes something very different. So we need to rethink our story of crisis. And in that vein, consider this abbreviated history. In 1910, W.E.B. Du Bois, when founding a magazine to speak truth to power at the NAACP, could aptly call it the crisis. Crisis, as it used to be, lay ahead. Vanguardist progressives could rally around it and be emboldened by it. But by 2010, crisis had become something entirely different. Recall Obama's uneasy subprime era refrain, the number of times he said, "We are in the midst of a deep crisis." Remember how his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, his secretary of state, all echoed a dictum by a particular Nobel laureate, someone who was previously a Stanford professor, Paul Romer. They all repeated his dictum that, I quote, "a serious crisis is a terrible thing to waste." Joe Masco, anthropologist of American crises cultures and their fallout, declared of that bitter decade that a crisis in crisis had occurred. Crisis had become, simply put, a counter-revolutionary idiom. Crisis closed, rather than opened, routes to other possible better worlds. If you are in this room today, I suspect you share my feeling that crisis as it is now, today, in our half-done decade, is a little more harrowing, something even worse. Crisis today binds us to the fix. It naturalizes the imperative that all politics, insurgent and imperial, better be urgently instrumental in these fire-putting out ways. As Cameron Hu, ethnographer of our climate polycrisis, elegantly summarizes, we have all become kinds of crisis actors. Crisis as it is now damages our prospects for intelligibility. We face what Jonathan Lear called a crisis of intelligibility itself. Its urgencies warp how we think of action, of means and ends. It shreds our expectations of moral and political agreement. So crisis has changed, but have our responses. And to answer this, I'll draw on a dissident tradition in moral philosophy, which saliently saw a lot of this coming. In the aftermath of World War II, Elizabeth Anscombe refused to admit or honor wartime urgencies. She instead looked to the center of the culture which preceded and celebrated crisis as an opportunity, diagnosing what was latent in its practical rationality. And she, memorably, thinking about Harry Truman and his use of the nuclear bomb, named the spread of modern crisis moralities as consequentialist. By this, Anscombe condemned our focus on what a sufficient justification for the consequences of any action could be. She condemned how that kept us from duly acknowledging how the killing of innocents in Anscombe's time, as in now, has become intrinsic to modern life and to modern war. So if that was 1956, what comes into view in 2026? How could we name and diagnose the instrumental rationality that is distinctive to our now? How could we uncover its underlying certainties? So in closing, in the spirit of opening up a conversation, I offer 3 observations on rules, on selves, and on the market morality that is dominant today. If 2 decades ago, wartime torture was a scandal and a crisis, we can be pretty sure it isn't now. If even a decade ago, crisis morality worried about the difference between just and unjust wars, it doesn't need those justifications now. We live today in a world of not unjust war, but just war. War without end. Mere war. War without regulations or rules. And rules are, of course, since Wittgenstein, understood to be not commands inferred, but attitudes, sensibilities which a self must be trained into so that we might be disposed to them at all. So my first suggestion and observation is that there is much about a contemporary crisis culture which promotes not rule following, but a distinct culture of rule hollowing. And once we acknowledge that, we can see that since the 1920s, post-crisis responses have promoted and established a morality and mythology of self-regulation. This allowed for banks to be bailed out. It authorized self-regulatory organizations like the SEC or the New York Stock Exchange that promote free markets within the hollows of liberal democracy. But this self-regulationism, to coin a name for this morality of our now, fulfills and outstrips consequentialism. What once authorized markets now authorized hollow self-regulating selves who are no longer even bound to their justifications. Third, these selves are so used to moving fast and breaking things that they are compulsively drawn towards hastening new crisis. They seek to profit by breaking what agreement and mutual intelligibility we might still have and share. As the CEO of Kalshi put it, his quest is, and I quote, to transform every difference of opinion into a financial asset. If insider trading was once a scandal and a crisis, then now the market taunts and tempts it out into the open. Bet on your own team, we're told it's fine. Even truth, as poly-marketed today, will self-regulate and follow the money. Folks, crisis really isn't what it used to be. So all of us have to ask why we self-regulate, when we do it, how we do it, and to what ends. Why hold on to our hopes of crisis as it used to be? Why still expect critique to do what it once used to do?
I'm just really grateful I'm here. And I would like to just begin to open space and time for more conversation. 2026 began with a crisis of xenophobia. Consistent news reports revealed masked ICE agents abducting immigrants, separating families, malnourishing detainees, and killing protesters. Protesters, activists, and intellectuals hit the streets in the cold. Yet, a surprising side of resistance would emerge: the Super Bowl halftime show held in the Bay Area. This year's performer was Bad Bunny, who, if you could not tell from his stage name, is from Puerto Rico. Anticipation of a confrontational performance intensified after he made a polemic statement. ICE out after winning his Grammy Award a week before. How would a globally beloved artist from a colonial island of the United States respond to anti-immigrant actions of the US government? The show opens with a young man standing before tall sugar canes while holding a guitar and donning a pava, a hat worn by field workers called jibaros. With a smile, he says, "Que rico es el Latino," or se ve. Today you see how sweet, how lovely, how good it is to be Latino. For the next 13 minutes, images of sugar fields and jibaros to everyday scenes of dancing and eating and family bonding and people playing and laughing and living in community appeared. This public performance of dance and music was not entertainment. It was an invitation to celebrate people enjoying activities of everyday life. Facing a crisis of state-sanctioned xenophobia, this celebration became critique. The invitation to celebrate became resistance. During my time at the Humanities Center, don't say the wrong university, I have been writing about portrayals of dance as an intellectual act in early 20th century Black writing. A poem that posed me is The Negro Dancer by Jamaican writer Claude McKay. The Negro Dancer was first published in July of 1919 for The Liberator, a socialist newspaper. Comprised of 3 stanzas, the poem portrays an intellectual's observations of couples dancing in a dimly lit basement to the sound of fiddle, drums, and clarinet. The scene is not a public arena with countless people watching, but a hideaway location, perhaps in Harlem, or Brooklyn, or Chicago, or DC, that offers respite from spectatorship and surveillance. In the first stanza, the intellectual sees the dancers as, quote, vacant-eyed and laughing puppets who dance to forget their world of shadows. In the second stanza, the intellectual decides to do what intellectuals do. The intellectual beholds the dancers with empathy and attentiveness. "'Tis best to sit and gaze, my heart then dances, to the live bodies gliding slowly by, the amorous and inimitable glances that subtly pass from roguish eye to eye. Here, our seated intellectual sees subtle shifts in the dancer's eyes that are no longer vacant, but roguish. A rapturous recognition occurs. For them, the dance is the true joy of life. By the start of the third stanza, the seated intellectual of the poem realizes how profound and political this expression of joy is in this dimly lit basement. And yet, they are the outcasts of the earth, a race oppressed and scorned by ruling man. How can they thus consent to joy and mirth who live beneath a world eternal ban? Outcasts of the earth. African Americans in the second decade of the 20th century returned from fighting abroad as soldiers for the United States in World War I, only to return to the United States needing to fight against the very citizens and government they fought for. A race oppressed? The summer of 1919, the year the Negro Dances was published, was called the Red Summer on account of the fatal violence against African Americans that exploded across 26 cities. Lynchings increased. Mobs attacked African Americans in city streets. Race riots lasting for days destroyed homes and displaced families. A race scorned by ruling man. In 1915, President Woodrow Wilson, the top ruling man of the US government, screamed D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation on the White House lawn. The film, if you haven't seen it, visually recast free African Americans as politically corrupt, civically dangerous, and sexually violent. Imagine a president using the most cutting-edge media technology of the day to propagate dehumanizing visual images against Black people and people of color to justify violence, exclusion, and animosity against them. But I return to the intellectual's question. How can they thus consent to joy and mirth? The intellectual facing the crisis even concedes that no faith is theirs, no shining ray of hope, except that death will liberate them from this oppressed condition. And while a very real resignation that tempts all of us who do intellectual work in crisis appears to reign at the absence of an answer to this question, this intellectual continues to analyze the dancer's eyes and sees that their eyes no longer carry vacancy nor roguishness, but poetry. But oh, they dance with poetry in their eyes. As the poetry in their eyes evoked, this leisure, this dance was not empty-minded merriment, but emancipatory movement. In the crisis of the Red Summer, this intellectual had no definitive answer as to how these dancers consented to joy and mirth. In a way, their right to opacity remains honored. Yet even when faced with the limits of comprehension, intellectuals are called upon in crises to recognize and celebrate when people in everyday life create consent to joy and mirth. Whenever people in everyday life create consent to joy and mirth in the face of a crisis, intellectual work has been done. To create consent to joy and mirth is intellectual. And this work happens and is happening today. I'll close with a poem that celebrates celebration as intellectual work. It's a poem by Lucille Clifton that invites celebration. It begins, "Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model, born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. Thank you.
For those of you that are, I know many of you are already well acquainted with our center, but for those of you that are less well acquainted with us, you've heard 4 people, 4 scholars. There are about 45 more of them who were here with us this year, and we could have staged this event 10 times over and had 10 times as many perspectives and provocative challenges to what we're all doing here together. And I'd like to start a kind of conversation among the group. And when I first sat down here, I did not think I would ask a question actually about an institution like this one, the Stanford Humanities Center, because it would not normally be my intention to be that solipsistic. But having heard the 4 of you, I can't resist asking a sort of a 2-part question about it. And that is, the first part is, several of you have talked about the function of an educational institution is to create consciousness, to, I think Shay said, expand horizons. An institution like this one has a very specialized purpose, which is to take in scholars who are at different levels of formation and put them all together in ways that take them out of their everyday experience, and especially create the conditions of mutual encounter, if not friction, intellectual friction, to expose them to perspectives that they don't encounter normally. That is a sort of an obligation of an institution like this one, but it also entails a lot of challenges, and it is not easy to do. You don't just throw people together. You have to create the conditions in which they come together in such a way that it's productive for them, and we spend a lot of time worrying about that. So 2-part question. First part is there and obviously I didn't prepare them for this, or I would have told them to think about this ahead of time. This totally comes out of hearing them. But is there a moment or an episode or an event you can point to during the year, especially having to do with the encounter with someone else in this center, that we could take as an example of that kind of consciousness, expansion of consciousness that's gone on for you? That's the first part, and I'll say the second part now, and then you can answer first part or second part as you wish. Second part is, under the conditions that you're all describing, in which we're living in a historical moment that has challenge, if not unprecedented challenges, incredible challenges. Is there anything that an institution like this should be doing differently? Stanford Humanities Center is a middle-aged institution. It was created in 1980. We've adapted as best we can to the moment, but we always are thinking, are we doing enough? And are there things we should be doing differently? And are we living in such a crisis that we have to really radically rethink the way we operate? So those are my 2 questions. Your own experience this year, and then the sort of institutional question. Whoever wants to go.
I believe I'm being deputed as internal fellow. Yeah, Roland, that first you promoted me, now you're gonna. I'm very fond of a moral philosopher called Alistair MacIntyre, and MacIntyre thinks about 2 aspects of the good. One are the kinds of goods that we can name. Justice might be a good that is fast disappearing from our world. But then he also thinks about the kind of thing that is an internal good, a kind of good that you learn by doing something, in the doing of it. And the internal good turns out to be something that you can point to. Tim has it. We all saw it. The internal good of being able to deliver a certain kind of message in the delivering of it. And I think the thing for me this year that has been the most powerful for me has been two. I was saying that we're doing Tuesday on Thursday today, because every Tuesday we've had the privilege of being in the company of each other. And sometimes when you go to an academic event, a visiting scholar is coming, they're on campus for a day, and you can ask whatever question you want to ask. And then you don't have to go to lunch with them for the rest of the year. But but to not make a joke about it and to be serious, there is something about the internal good of scholarship that I've learned this year that I can point to. You may not see it in my book when it eventually comes out 3 years on, but you will see it in the books of everyone who I have had the company, whose company I've been able to share. In terms of, maybe I can circle back around for the second part.
I knew I wasn't the smartest person in the room in first grade. Lindsay and Robert spelled environment and excellent, and I couldn't figure out how to spell that. So when I got in the midst of everyone here, I was so happy to be around such brilliant, wonderful people who speak multiple languages. And for me, it's true, the ability to just be able to commune and to hear different scholars of different fields risk thinking, but also admit limitations has been breathtaking for me. I needed it deeply. And how I wish others like me could have the chance to be in the midst of brilliant, but at least in this cohort, humble and gracious people who are just saying some fantastic thoughts on brave issues, and then at the same time admitting the very intellectual fears and limitations I have to allow me to find more of my voice. I've been very blessed here, so I can't really answer the second one, but I will say this. There was one conversation, and not to call you out, Sora, but I'm amazed that there's hummingbirds on this campus. I'm from New York, and I'm used to pigeons. And then I was talking to Sora, and Sora gave a talk about hummingbirds, a mother hummingbird caring for its child, and how she compared hummingbirds to drones, and the drone and just the mixing of sounds and the ways that sounds can be used and manipulated to move from the beauty of animal life to military. And this is one example of one conversation that just transformed my own being on this campus, and being able to just have my mind expanded ethically, politically, but also aesthetically. And so, yeah.
Okay, I won't take it up. I wanted to shout out AJ. Because after I presented my my work to all of the fellows, AJ asked me a really hard question that I hadn't thought about, because my work is centered so much on grief and mourning and negative affects. They asked me how I was defining happiness and what my work was allowing me to think about when it came to joy, and whether that's the opposite of grief or not. And to Tim's point, I humbly said, I don't know. But it's something that I think has been germinating. And I think that has been the pleasure and the privilege of being here, is having my work scrutinized, but in the most generous and generative of ways. I am very sometimes like overprotective of what I do, because I feel like it is limited, and it is there's so much that I haven't been able to do yet. But the work and my my identity as an intellectual has grown in what has been such a really beautiful garden of people. As far as the second one, I am merely a grad student, so
I guess that leaves me for the second question. Thanks, guys. Okay. I think one way to approach the second question, what should institutions be doing differently? I'll take this as institutions broadly. Higher education is in a moment right now. And when I say higher education, I'm talking about all of us. I'm talking about administrators. I'm talking about faculty. I'm talking about students. I'm talking about staff. Higher education, we're in a moment right now where we need to decide what this project is about. And parents send their kids to us. They send their kids here, their students to us at a high cost to get something more than the lessons that we as professors teach them in their classrooms. And we need to decide what that thing is. What I believe it should be is that we should be places that are cultivating socially responsible and politically engaged people. Not only people who can just go and work on Wall Street or work in tech or, go on and just make a lot of money. We need to be able to cultivate people who can understand the issues, who can think about them dynamically, who just don't retreat from political questions, who don't retreat from political crises. And I think what that means in higher education is that students need spaces to be able to try on political identities. They need to be able to try on different political identities. They need to be able to protest freely. They need to be able to engage with each other passionately, but responsibly and respectfully. And yeah, I think that is something that we need to seriously think about right now in higher education. So thank you for that question.
Well, since nobody wants to answer the second question other than Amanda, I will just say thank you for that. I couldn't agree more. And I'll just say my own reflection on my answer to my own question. The second one is that I think that we, at a place like this, we need to, specifically this center, I think we need to double down on identifying fellows at all levels who can productively converse with each other in ways that might not be available in other settings, including if they come from elsewhere or even elsewhere at Stanford. When I was an external fellow many years ago, a number of years before I became a professor at Stanford. And when I was a fellow, the Stanford Humanities Center was a very different place. We were, I don't know how they chose us, but we had nothing in common with each other. And we were just probably the highest ranking people in the competition. And then we were put together. And fast forward now 30 some years, the way we do it now is we spend a lot of time trying to anticipate who would talk to whom, who would enlarge whom, who might disagree with whom productively. And we spend so much time on that. We spend more time on that actually than we do just ranking people by their levels of distinction. And I think at a moment like this, we need that to cultivate that capacity more than ever. And so I look forward to continuing to do that because I think it's very important for the future of an institution like this that we be a model for the kind of enlargement or consciousness expansion that we're all talking about here. There are too few institutions in which this is possible and in which this is celebrated and that have the resources to do it at such a scale. And I think we have to really embrace that privilege and use it to model the kinds of things that you're all talking about. Let me open the conversation to the whole room and invite questions and comments from everyone who's here. We have some microphones going around.
So thank you so much for 4 amazing papers. I'm going to take up Amanda's challenge about looking at terms and not look at crisis, but what is an intellectual. And you mentioned Tony K. Bambara and June Jordan. I'm going to mention 2 other names, and I think you'll know where I'm going. Adrienne Rich and Audre Lorde, because these 4 all left various kinds of teaching positions and employment to go to CUNY University when it was open admissions. And they began this amazing experiment working with students and encouraging students to write, and they published student anthologies. So I'm thinking that a crisis that we might think about is the way that the neoliberal university is driving a wedge between faculty and students in all sorts of different ways. So that was one point I was going to make. And the other point was going to link up with Timothy's amazing paper, which is about wokeness, which comes out of a Leadbelly song in 1938. And the way that it's been taken up by Elon Musk, the woke mind virus, and think of it like an attack on empathy, right? The idea that certain populations are just not worthy of what he calls them non-playing characters, right? So could you both talk about this idea of how maybe the crisis is also in our capacity to be empathetic?
Yeah, David, thank you for that comment. I'm so glad that you brought up CUNY. You know, when I first came here to Stanford, I was so enthusiastic to go to the library, in part because they have they are one of the few universities that have the actual collection, the thoughts of Audre Lorde, June Jordan, and Tony K. Bambara on the Black University and ideas about the Black University. And so what was happening at CUNY, I'm so glad that you raised this, students and professors were partnering together to kind of like look at the world and then kind of backwards plan what type of education was needed to think about and to understand, so that people could understand the world around them, so that students could understand the world around them. And it was such an important model of not only collaboration, but just thinking about how education can serve the moment. And they did that through the SEEK program that Tony K. Bambara was deeply involved with at CUNY. And I think it would be amazing to go back to Roland's second question, to think about how can we look to some of these community student university collaborations of the past that were underfunded, and all of these there were all these reasons why they didn't continue, mostly because of lack of support, financial support. How can we look at those as potential ways to think about the types of relationality that we need to understand crisis and to kind of just live in these times? And I'll hand empathy over to Tim.
Thank you for the question. I've been thinking about empathy a lot from the perspective of my training in literature, but also Black studies. Empathy is viewed as a kind of a troublesome word because it has been used as a way to kind of seize the plight by non-Black individuals with Black experience or Black plight. And empathy has been viewed as a moral shortcut. And so if we go into a site of learning, if we believe that we learn certain techniques or methods or theories, that we can immediately claim to know what someone is thinking or feeling or desiring or should desire because we've learned certain theories. So it's a model of education where a mode of knowing morally becomes a mode of capture. And so Black studies has kind of resisted the word empathy. It's almost like a bad word. And so part of what's fascinated me in my research with Black art is the way that Black art nonetheless creates an even more profound sense of empathy, not as an ability to know what another person feels or thinks immediately, but rather an awareness that we are beholden to each other simply because we are breathing the same air together. To enter into this room is the very beginning of learning because I'm affecting you and you're affecting me. here we are together. And that atmospheric receptivity is empathy. And if that can become the kind of groundwork for a sense of learning together, then it doesn't produce a sense of knowledge as capture or knowledge as a way of mastering a certain theory over a person's life, but rather a way of listening and being affected by, and as one is affected by, being able to reflect on why and how I'm affected by you being in the room, and their empathy can begin to do good work, I think. And yeah, thank you for the question. I hope I answered.
Okay, thank you everyone for these wonderful presentations. I have been thinking a lot since we got the invitation to submit something for the intellectual in a time of crisis. You say, Timothy, empathy. That's a word I use it also in my piece. I start one of the paragraphs with empathy. I think there are many things, especially about the second question I have been thinking. Those are questions that also my students ask me. How do you, Mario, can continue still connected with your community? How do you continue doing that? I will say, and I think some people here, they do similar work where we try to connect with the community always. It's more work because unfortunately these spaces, they don't take into account or they don't consider the work that many times we do in the communities. So in the evaluations, in promotions, the peer review articles will be the ones, or the book, So how do we challenge that? If we want to do community projects, if we want to, I use the phrase of the ivory tower, right? If we want to have one step or one of our feet outside this space, how do we continue being productive here in this nevertheless institution? So those are questions I also have, and I want to invite you to think about that. And I think empathy we can also use for being with the people. I love when AJ you presented your work and you say that your mom didn't exactly know where Stanford was, right? Like I remember that part, and many people around Stanford, they don't even know what is Stanford. So why? I think it's important to question that, what is happening and what we are doing to really expand.
I think if we're able to find other communities and be open to learning the ways other communities think about particular problems and the way they define crises in their own terms, then I think there may be a chance for our work to not be so siloed from them. But it's difficult. It's an act of translation. It's an act of humility. It's an act of being willing to learn, despite one of the difficulties of being in education is that you develop an ego, and so and nothing is smaller than an ego, and finding a way to kind of get over that, and then be in the community and realize they have another way of thinking, particularly about how to define and resist and overcome crises. And for me, I think to go back to empathy, I think if you are able to empathize with people's happiness, then there's something really open about you. If you're only able to empathize with their plight or their sadness, but if you're able to empathize with their celebration, even if you don't understand, then there's something really open about you. And I think some tremendous learning can happen with you in the room.
Thank you all so much for your amazing work this year and today. I'm looking at you as 4 witnesses and interpreters today. And my question is really about witnessing and interpreting now and for the future, for our students, in our teaching, in our research. How do we do that? How do we think about that? And just an aside for Roland's second question, kind of connecting with Mario, it's also possible to invite fellows who are knowledge producers who are not in the academy, different forms. And I know other spaces do that.
Yeah. Yes, go ahead. Please, and then Branislav and Esra. Did you want to respond to the question of witness? Do you want to respond or talk? Or we can also take a few questions and then start a conversation.
Okay, thank you all so much. Thank you, Roland, for really carefully curated panel and carefully curated cohort of fellows. I enjoyed this here tremendously. My question is inspired by, or really prompted by, Mudit's presentation, but the question is addressed to everyone. At one point in the 80s, Henri Lefebvre said that Europe at that point was going through the crisis of crisis. So there was a crisis of crisis unfolding. So maybe that was the point when the crisis, the idea, the nature of crisis changed. I'm not so convinced. So my question is, when did, and actually I think it would be useful to try to think in specificities, not generalities. When did the crisis change its nature? When did the crisis become what it is now? How? What is the specific moment that we might be able to identify that marked this turning point of the crisis that we are experiencing now?
One more question and then return.
Sure. Okay, one more and then.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. As I was listening to you, I started making a list of verbs that an intellectual can do, like be awake rather than sleep, dance and move rather than stand still, grieve rather than forget, and obviously speak up rather than be silent is a self-evident verb. And then I remembered Branislav's, the co-fellow who spoke just before me. His Branislav, in your contribution to the website that we were asked to write about intellectuals in the time of crisis, he defines 4 types of silence, like silence as integrity, silence because of fear, silence because of skepticism and helplessness. And a new type of silence that is emerging in this moment is silence because of opportunism, like intellectuals who are not speaking, or universities administrators who are not speaking because they are waiting who will win, or because they're afraid of losing money, or some sort of opportunism. And that made me think of Mudit's presentation about, taking the opportunistic road, or making a profit out of crisis, disaster capitalism, and so on. And obviously, if we are living in a neoliberal time that is creating this opportunistic university. So my question is, which also relates to Roland's second question, what type of a university do we need in this moment? What is the opposite of opportunism? What is a non-opportunistic university as opposed to the, neoliberal opportunistic university that is defining the new crisis that Mudit talked about?
A lot of questions there, you guys.
Folks, I don't want to be a downer, but I will be for a second. Sorry, I almost dropped the mic as well. I do think something drastic is changing under our feet. I think the nature of the world, the nature of what we publicly agreed upon as truth, the nature of how selves relate over something like truth, how truth is attainable in practice and in relationship, is changing. And the sources of the derangement of this are multiple. We all feel it. If at some point in the last year you have felt that the world no longer makes sense, that is the crisis of sensibility that intimates that there is a crisis now, not in the fact that the world has stopped being intelligible, but that intelligibility itself is under attack, that there is profit to be made on that. I'm helped in many ways. Branislav, I can't give you a year or a date, but I'm helped. Well, I mean, all I have is hints. I mean, I would love a conversation about it with everyone. I would say this, that Vincent Bevins is a wonderful journalist, and he wrote an incredible book on the mass protests of the last decade, on the fact that the 2010s saw more people on the streets asking for the things that we are all agreed on here, and yet none of that came to pass. What we ended up in is the authoritarian coming across the globe. And I would encourage everyone to read that book and kind of think of where they're at by where he leaves us. The question of what is the opposite of opportunism is a question that also then points us back to the fact that sometimes it's not about the when, but about the undertow, the slow moving undertow of this world. And this is a word, again, that Cameron Hu uses in his work. It's hard to witness, Lynn, because truth has changed. You know, one of the things that happens in the WhatsApp groups in the communities that I'm in is that anything I say, there can always be another video that can be forwarded that says the opposite, right? And that kind of liberal impasse, the staging of it, the pleasure in it, the kind of the repetition of it is something that is very hard to step outside of. There is a wide set of arguments about the fact that there was a difference between practical rationality and propositional knowledge and practical knowledge. And I'm drawn back to this abstract seeming distinction because there is the stuff that lives in the books, that lives in the library that surrounds us. And then there is the thing that comes together by doing. And I really feel if the university is to be reformed, if it is to be redone, it will have to be around that kind of doing together. And I don't mean this in a somewhat abstract way, other than to just second what Amanda said earlier, that even more than you got to learn how to inhabit a different language, and that's only possible with other people. I am failing now. Someone else will complete this thought much better, and I will learn from them. And the next time I will be ready. Before I'm a downer, I leave it there.
I wanted to add something that is also kind of asking, because this is something I wanted to ask you after your presentation. Because I think in connection to what Branislav was pointing out and what you just mentioned as far as like the past 10 years of frustrated protest and a rise of authoritarianism, of surveillance, it feels like since the early 2000s, there's been a huge nosedive in the feeling of self-efficacy amongst the average person. The idea that there is no point in voting, there's no point in protesting, there's no point in trying to safeguard your privacy because they already know everything. There's just been this tumbling sense of powerlessness that is incredibly widespread. And I think that the effectiveness of that sort of burial of self-efficacy is that now there's no need to manufacture consent anymore. You're not manufacturing consent, you're manufacturing powerlessness. And so whether or not you agree that we should, be going to war in Iran, we're at war with Iran. And it's like, okay, that we didn't get like the ability of this administration to do impeachable offenses like every Tuesday is like literally every day. Yes, even saying weekly is too much, but it's like people are becoming acclimated to crisis, no recourse, corruption, etc. And so I don't know if that is a too small of a scope to say, since like 2002. But that's how it feels to me. And so I'm curious about what your thoughts would be.
I'm a historian, and I have many dates that I'm thinking of. Well, it's an interesting question, Bronislaw. Like has the bottom completely fallen out? I feel like is also what I'm hearing from Mudit and Sheyi. Like, and how do we know when the bottom has fallen completely out? Is it possible for the bottom to fall completely out? And as a historian, I would absolutely say, yes, it is possible. And it has happened in this very country. There has been a civil war here. So yeah, I think, so I love the question. I don't have a date either, but I appreciate the proposition. And Sheyi, I'm glad that you, I'm starting to forget things. Who said doing? I don't remember where that came from. Okay, doing. Okay, Mudit and then Sheyi. Doing and power. That's what I wanted to say. The connection between doing and power. Sheyi brought up power. Mudit brought up doing. And Mario, you brought up community. I think the question, the comments that we've had so far, kind of about empathy, about kind of like these effective, these comments about like affect and our ability to kind of see each other and one another are important. But I also think that we need to be explicit about power, and we need to be explicit about powerlessness. And we need to be explicit about action. We need to be explicit about kind of more than interpretation is necessary, Lynn. I think more than witnessing is necessary. I think the move beyond the affective to the what can we do? How can we amass power? And I think coming back to Mario, I think the answer is rooted in this idea of shedding the individual and thinking about the community and thinking about what sources of power are within a relation that we have slowly shedded over the last 20 years or more. Maybe it's in the 1980s. So those are my thoughts.
It's about time for us to continue the conversation outside in our reception. Before we do that, I want to thank, of course, I want to thank these four, but I also want to, almost unofficially, we're not quite there yet, but I want to sort of bring the academic year here at the SHC to a close by thanking all of our fellows this year for their incredible level of engagement with each other, not just their own projects, of course, but with each other and with the larger purposes of an institution like this. Every year we have a very hard time saying goodbye to that year's cohort, but this year I've been stopped in the hall over and over by our staff saying, we are really going to be sorry to see this group go. They have been exceptionally cohesive and multifarious in their views about things, and very, they're very productively in disagreement with each other a lot. But it's been a fantastic experience to be with all of you, the four of you and all the rest of you. So we will have to look forward to staying in touch with you in the next chapter. Let me just conclude by saying that you're all welcome. If you want more of this, you're all welcome to go and visit the colloquy on the subject of the intellectual in a time of crisis. Some of these people and many of the other fellows have contributed and are contributing pieces, and you can go there and find them. Just go to our website, shc.stanford.edu. You can't miss it. It's right there. And I can't emphasize enough that collection of pieces is not just a one-way broadcast from fellows to the world, but it's open for comment, it's open for submissions, it's open for reproduction. You can pick out pieces there and share them with others. So please join us online and feel free to continue the conversation there after this occasion is over. Thank you all for coming. Please join us outside.